Good evening, everyone. I'm Jessica Hellman. I'm a professor at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm the director of our Global Change Adaptation Research Program and the research director at the ND Global Adaptation Index. And it's a wonderful privilege to be with all of you here today. It's particularly a privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, our keynote speaker, Ann Thompson. So she said to keep my biographical summary short. So Ann has pursued a truly extraordinary broadcasting career. She currently serves as NBC News' Chief Environmental Affairs Correspondent. As an example of her extraordinary work, she has traveled to Copenhagen to cover climate change negotiations. She's been to Greenland and the Amazon and to Europe to report on climate and other environmental issues. Her leadership of the Gulf oil spill coverage made her the 2010 NBC News correspondent with the most airtime. Which is why you all recognize her, right? And for her exceptional work, she's received the 2004 and 2006 Gerald Loeb Awards, which is the most prestigious honor in business journalism. And importantly for us at the University of Notre Dame, she is honored that she serves on our board of trustees. She clearly possesses an extraordinary understanding of how climate change impacts corporations, governments, and communities worldwide. And she recognizes the importance of our topic today, climate change adaptation, and the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index, now and increasingly in the future. So please join me in warmly welcoming Ann Thompson.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Joyce, for asking me here today. You know, it's always a treat to come to Washington, D.C. I've done my job for now more decades than I would care to admit, but I am a sucker for this city because I just walk down Pennsylvania Avenue and I look at the Capitol or I see the White House and I get inspired all over again. And I just love being here. But I'm also very privileged to be here because I really do believe that the work of ND GAIN is crucial, not just to surviving, but thriving in this era of climate change. As it is in every aspect of our lives, information is the critical component to solving our problems. And just as importantly, when it is used correctly, information helps us avoid our problems. We live in a time where we have more access to information than any other time in history. If you think about this, all that's in a single issue of the Sunday New York Times is more information than an American colonist had in an entire year. We are bombarded 24/7. There's the TV, the radio, internet, the Twittersphere. All of these give us all kinds of information, but you don't have to read much or listen much to quickly know that not all of that information is equal or credible. In our information world, it is possible to trade in the media equivalent of junk bonds. With all these different resources, it is easy to find the information, the statistics, the resources that you want to hear. Those that back up your own preconceived notions, and we all have them, without listening to other points of view. In this environment, honest, agenda-free brokers in information are more important than ever before. They serve as a constant light, guiding their clients and viewers and readers through the fog of conspiracy theorists and those that offer up information with their finger firmly on the scale. In the past few weeks, we've seen a legitimate issue like Ebola tossed around like a football. The media and politicians have used Ebola to score points, to scare their audiences, to generate ratings, to strike a campaign blow in the heart of an election season. Science took a back seat. Fear played front and center. If a person does not have the symptoms of the virus, they cannot transmit Ebola to another person by means of a bowling ball, a subway strap. If you've ridden on the New York subway, and I ride it all the time, good Lord, there are all kinds of things you can catch. Ebola is not one of them. Just check out the rats on the F train in the bottom of Rockefeller Center. Or you can't even catch it if you go on a bike ride. Even if you are in the close confines of an economy class in airplane, your seatmate cannot give you Ebola if they are asymptomatic. And science tells us that the symptoms of Ebola are horrific and obvious. As I watched the coverage and the political spats from both sides of the aisle, I couldn't help but think, if we can't understand how Ebola is transmitted, how in the world are we ever going to get our heads around the far more nuanced and interdisciplinary subject of climate change? Well, to help the world learn to adapt to climate change, to understand what is working and what needs to be done, comes the ND Gain Index. The index presents itself as an honest broker that we all wish we could get all our information from, ranking 175 countries on how they are preparing to deal with our changing climate. It is a dynamic index, ever evolving, taking into consideration more data and new information as nations seek ways to protect their infrastructures, access to water, healthcare, and other systems. The goal of the ND Gain Index is to enhance the world's understanding about adaptation and its importance, providing information to help us chart our course through an uncertain future and enable us to proactively make good decisions about how we do business. And there are many decisions to make. This week, in summarizing 5 years of scientific research, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued its latest report, showing that climate change is happening on every continent and across all the oceans. The report warns that our window of opportunity to stave off the most disastrous effects of climate change is closing fast. By 2050, the report says we must reduce our carbon emissions by anywhere from 40 to 70%. And even if we do that, the report says we will face longer and more intense heat waves, rainstorms and snowstorms that give us more precipitation, oceans that are more acidic, and sea levels will continue to rise. It wasn't that long ago, in fact, 2009, when I was in Copenhagen for the last climate change negotiations, and I was riding on the subway there, which had no rats, with a delegate from Bangladesh. And he turned to me in absolute frustration and said, "Why don't Americans think that climate change is real?" He said his country was already feeling the impacts of climate change. And I told him it was pretty simple. It was because Americans hadn't felt the impacts of climate change yet. Well, how much has changed in a short time? Think about it. The 2011 drought in Texas, exacerbated by climate change, according to that state's climatologist and NOAA, it caused $8 billion in losses. Superstorm Sandy in 2012 slammed into the northeastern seaboard with a punishing storm surge that was a foot higher because sea levels were a foot higher than a century ago. It caused some $65 billion in damage. And then there is the ever-lengthening wildfire season out in the western part of the country. The Union of Concerned Scientists reports that that season lasted 5 months in 1970. Today, it is more than 7 months, with 250 fires a year of more than 1,000 acres. That's 110 more a year than just 30 years ago. Unlike in 2009, today America understands the climate is changing. We are seeing and living it for ourselves. The question is no longer about science. The question is, what do we have the political will to do something about it? Is there the political will in this country to take on climate change? If that will exists, I would argue that Tuesday's election does not make its path any easier. And this is where I give you your own personal nightly news report on yesterday's election. So I'm going to channel Andrea Mitchell. Action on climate change is a top priority, as you know, of President Obama's second term. He says it's a moral obligation that this nation has to future generations, to leave them a planet that is not polluted and damaged. And prior to Tuesday's results, the administration appeared determined to use its executive powers to address climate change. Because while it had laid out a climate action plan, the president had failed to find congressional partners on climate change in the Republican Party. As a leader, he inspired few to his cause. Speaking here in Washington last week, and I can out-bill here for this, Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz said the administration will continue to aggressively pursue the goals laid out in the Climate Action Plan with its executive authority. Moniz essentially doubled down on the promise, saying there is a fundamental commitment that starts with the president on moving to a low-carbon future. Today, the new Republican Senate majority made it clear it has a different agenda. One of the high priority items on that agenda is the approval of the Keystone XL pipeline, which is an anathema to many Greens in this country. In fact, North Dakota Senator John Hoeven told an interviewer today that the Republicans will introduce standalone legislation at the start of next year to approve that controversial pipeline. Now, this afternoon at his press conference, when asked about Keystone and any potential Republican legislation, the president said there is an independent process that is moving forward. He basically dodged the question, but referred to this independent process, which we believe was the court case that is currently going through in Nebraska. And then he outlined his parameters for approval. Is it going to increase jobs? Is it going to lower gas prices? And is it going to increase climate change? Now, changes in control of the Senate also means changes in chairmanships. Replacing liberal California Democrat Barbara Boxer as head of the Senate's Committee on Environment and Public Works appears to be James Inhofe of Oklahoma. Senator Inhofe believes that catastrophic climate change is a hoax. He's compared the EPA to the Gestapo, and he's suggested that the EPA's plan to reduce carbon emissions from power plants is not an effort to protect the American people, but rather to control them. As you can see, he has not embraced the president's agenda. And I don't think it's going out on a limb to say that such divergent opinions would suggest more gridlock here in Washington, at least when it comes to any kind of legislation that would put the United States on a path to a cleaner, greener economy. And though the White House and the Congress are just geographically 1.5 miles apart, the ideological differences on these issues would suggest that they are at the opposite ends of the world. With those two bodies of government so seemingly far apart, some may want to get out the funeral bunting and don black for any chances of advancement in climate change adaptation. But I would tell you that I think the real advances in adapting to climate change are being made by businesses and local leaders. The answers are not coming from the top down, if you generously consider the federal government the top. They're coming from the bottom up. They are born of necessity, reality, and opportunity. And that's one reason why I love covering the environment. Just look at what's happening with solar electricity. Long to ride, it is too expensive, a technology loved only by well-heeled hippies, and that may be an oxymoron. It is poised to be as cheap or cheaper than fossil fuel-generated electricity across most of the US in 2016. That comes from a Deutsche Bank report issued last month. That same report says that solar has already achieved grid parity in 10 states, and solar capacity is expected to grow 6-fold in the next 3 to 4 years in those states. This could be a game changer. Today's consumer wants products that are more energy efficient and kinder to the earth. Madison Avenue understands that people care about their kids and they want to leave them a better place. Green products work, and consumers want them to be mainstream. The furniture giant IKEA used to make its green products stand out. I know, I think I decorated an office I once had with all of recycled furniture or furniture made from recycled products from IKEA. And it had all kinds of unusual design and colors. And yes, it did have higher prices, but that is no more. The CEO of IKEA says that sustainability is now just part of the ethos. It should be, he insists, the way business is done. And that is making adapting to climate change good business. One of the things that I found really interesting in going over the ND Gain Index today is that the 10 countries that the index lists as best prepared for climate change, you can find those same 10 countries on Forbes magazine's list of the top 25 countries in the world to do business. These countries are meeting the needs of its people in a world of climate extremes while creating outstanding business climates. Adaptation is creating opportunity. Because more and more corporations are acknowledging that future risks are not just financial related, but climate related as well. In the words of former Goldman Sachs CEO and Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, climate change is the single biggest risk that exists to our economy today. Made in North Carolina is just a dot on that state's map. 50 miles outside of Charlotte, it is home to 3,300 people and the nation's largest privately owned solar array. It belongs to Apple, and it powers the company's biggest data center. In fact, all 4 of Apple's US data centers are powered by renewable energy. That means every time you share a picture on your iPhone, or you buy a song from iTunes, or you ask Siri a question, all that computer power is powered by renewable energy. Last spring, I went to Maiden to report on Apple's switch to renewable power for its data centers, and I spent some time with Apple's Vice President Lisa Jackson, who prior to that was head of the EPA. And I asked Lisa, I said, why are you doing this? And she said, because going green just makes good business sense. Data centers need a reliable, stable source of energy. Without that, they're nothing. And for Apple, that choice is solar. And then this September, Apple's CEO Tim Cook pointed to the array as evidence the choice that some set up between the environment and the economy. He said it's essentially a false choice. He said the array is great for the environment, and by the way, it's also good for economics. I would remind you that in the 3rd quarter of this year, Apple ranked #1 in the world for market capitalization. Adaptation also means not just inventing, but changing the way business is done. This September, some of the world's best-known corporations, Kellogg, Nestle's, and L'Oreal, pledged to help cut tropical deforestation in half by the end of this decade and stop it altogether by 2030. On the local level, there are all kinds of efforts underway to protect infrastructure and property. I don't know how many of you are from Boston, or if you've been to Boston. If you've gone to the new Seaport District along the Boston Harbor, there are all these brand new beautiful hotels. There are great restaurants to go to. There's the latest in urban living. But what they have done in the Seaport District, instead of putting all the electricity in the basement, they have moved it up to the roof to protect it from flooding. This fall, the city of Miami Beach began installing a system of pumps to deal with salt water flooding that is happening more and more frequently in that resort area at high tides. The water is coming up through the limestone bedrock, and it's putting at risk $23 billion in real estate. That's what we know and see now. But the future painted by this week's IPCC report suggests that the challenges will only become more difficult. Along with longer and more frequent heat waves and rain and snowstorms that are more intense, climate change is predicted to exacerbate health problems, particularly in the developing world, increase competition for water all around the world. And though the population will increase, production of basic grains are predicted to decline, and poor countries in the warmer and drier parts of the world will be the first to feel these effects. Consider this. Tonight, 1 in 8 people around the world will go to bed hungry, some 842 million people. Now consider how big that number could be in the year 2100. Yes, America feeds the world, but without adaptation and ultimately mitigation. This summer's Risky Business report predicts our agricultural production will be severely reduced by extreme heat. States in the Southeast, Lower Great Plains, and the Midwest, it says, are looking at 50 to 70% losses in average crop yields of corn, soy, and wheat by the end of the century. This is why the Department of Defense calls climate change a threat multiplier to national security, not just something that threatens U.S. coastal military operations with flooding, but that could impact every global issue from infectious diseases to terrorism. While the U.S. has the financial ability to adapt, for poorer nations, it's a much harder goal. The UN says that people who are marginalized socially, politically, or economically are especially vulnerable to climate change. Imagine you have no savings or insurance to replace what's lost in a severe storm, or flooding that wipes out where you lived, and now you have no place to go. Or you live in a place that has yet to endure such dramatic events, and you were flooded not by water, but by refugees. Imagine a world besieged by riots over dramatic increases in food prices, conflicts over who has access to water and how that water should be used. This is why many believe climate change has the potential to destabilize regions and countries by producing situations that can lead to conflicts, as it impacts the very necessities of life. Such dire scenarios, which undoubtedly provoke fear, are based in science, but so are the solutions. The ND Gain Index takes stock of these solutions, how they are implemented, what countries are adapting well, and what nations are not, revealing where examples are being set to lead the world and where the opportunities are for those in the business of providing answers to these problems. Though the task may seem daunting, for those of us who attended the University of Notre Dame, and by some miracle I graduated, we know to put ourselves in the shoes, or more appropriately, in the boots of the university's founder, Father Sorin. 162 years ago this month, Father Sorin went to South Bend, and he stopped at the site that is now Notre Dame. There was one building on the land, an old, dilapidated log cabin, described by Father Sorin as open to all the winds, and God help him because the wind blows. Not much of a shelter. In fact, that log cabin wasn't much of anything. But Father Sorin had a vision that his new school would be one of the most powerful means of doing good in this country. 37 years later, his vision and faith would be tested when fire destroyed the main building and threatened the very existence of the university he built. Instead of shrinking from that challenge, Father Sorin declared he would rebuild the university bigger and better than before. At Notre Dame, we learn never to shrink from any challenge, and that in confronting challenges, we do so in an effort to be that powerful means of doing good. The ND Gain Index is part of that tradition, to be that all-important, honest broker, to make the information accessible to businesses, governments, and nonprofits, a tool that uses information to build rather than to tear down or divide, to take on the greatest challenge of our time, climate change, and to do so in a way that lives up to Father Sorin's vision, to be a powerful means of doing good in this country and the world. Thank you very much.